It's very helpful at the start of a drawing to know if we intend to use marker for tonal values or whether we're just going to draw with line work and therefore with hatching to suggest value. Because there are some different choices that we make, some different ways of approaching our subject if we know we're going to use marker for the tones. So we've got this lovely Italian village street scene with this building like the prow of a ship right where the level of the hillside drops. And so we have a sharp hairpin bend, and we have narrow streets, and we have differing levels of buildings. Now, there is the one eye level in this, and all of the perspective angles operate as normal on this. Eye level is where if we draw a line across the whole picture, any horizontal lines that happen to be present in that place are horizontal, or it's going to be the place where the perspective angles that slope down and the perspective angles that slope up join. It's important to realize that we're not talking about the lines where the buildings touch the ground in this case, because the ground is not horizontal. And so those lines do not follow the same perspective pattern. Now, what I decided would be the most accurate way to draw this is to draw this central building, not so much because it's in the center per se, but because firstly, it's relatively simple in that it's facing us straight on, and it shouldn't be too hard compared to some of the other parts of the scene to get the proportions correct of the upper and lower stories. And so if I get this building worked out, and so the idea in my head is I'm drawing it pretty much as if it's the only building on the page, then I can use it to align left and right to help me position the other elements of the buildings alongside, whether it's their top corner, their bottom corner, where their windows are, where their doorways go. I can use the building that I've drawn to line up all of those spots, and then I can also put the ground in as well. I can align the ground with this central building, and because I go in one way and then the other way, it's a good way of maintaining the most accuracy. Should I make small mistakes, I'm not going to be building mistake upon mistake, but instead I might make a few little mistakes in one direction and a few little mistakes in the other direction, but the overall effect is, or the overall result is less mistakes. So at the moment though, I'm still drawing this in pen, and I find sometimes even when I intend to use marker, sometimes I will do a little bit of hatching, because establishing some value through hatching can help me get a sense of the proportions of the building or the structure better. It can be hard to get a strong sense of, are my proportions correct when I look at a reference if there are some dark tonal values that affect the way it looks on the reference. So I want to make my drawing look similar enough that I can get a sense of that. And so, for instance, that archway around the door, I wanted to put some darkness on because it helps me get a sense of, are the proportions of the doorway correct? Now, there are some plants and there are some other things above the doorway. I'm just looking at this now, and my doorway is probably not quite centered enough on the upper floor, but never mind. So when I'm now doing this side, first thing to notice is that the building is not in a straight line. It actually bends. There's a straight section and then it bends a bit further away. And they're the sorts of details we need to observe if we're going to successfully capture the feel of the street, because it also means that the corner, the bottom corner of that building is higher, much higher than it would be if the building didn't in fact bend. Because as it now tilts further away at a sharper angle, the perspective angles of the upper, but particularly the lower lines increase. Now, I've been drawing this with a 0.2 millimeter pen, but I have just switched to a 0.1 millimeter pen to do this building in the distance and then also the gap. Now, you'll see once I've established the central building, I then thought, well, the easiest thing to now establish is the end of the roadway up on the corner of the building, lower corner of the building on the left, and then that wall, and then the gap. So I don't think of drawing the building on the right, I think of drawing the gap first. And once I've done that, I can work out the height of the building by measuring across to the left-hand side to where it aligns with the windows that I've already drawn. And then I come forward, and as I come forward now, having switched back to my 0.2 millimeter pen, I can align both with the part of the drawing on the right that I've already now done, as well as with my starting building. So now I've got more parts to align with, and so it's more straightforward to do. These angles in the upper right are really pretty high. I probably haven't actually even drawn them quite angled high enough. And it's important to remember that every horizontal line is at a steeper angle than the one beneath it. And the higher up we go, the more steep, relatively speaking, the lines become. It's important that we don't ever just start drawing them as parallel lines. So here's a telegraph electricity wire. So trying to capture the rather wobbly lines of these wires, I think is part of capturing the charm of this village. Now, there are a few people, and while they're not obvious because they're all in the shadows, it's still helpful to draw them for that sense of scale that it gives. We want to be really careful with a scene like this when we reach the point where the building touches the ground. We don't want to draw a smooth straight line because these are not smooth straight surfaces. Particularly the ground is bumpy and gritty, and there's little bits of gravel and whatnot gets blown up against the bottom edges of the buildings. And so that does create a bit of a kind of gritty, bumpy, jagged effect. And if we draw a straight line, it makes it look like it's in a movie studio or something. And so we want to leave a bit of imperfection to create a sense of reality. So now I've got this doorway on the right-hand side, and all the time I'm aligning across to the right to see what it lines up with. Now, you're watching this, I think it's double time it's been doubled twice and then a quarter as fast again. So maybe that's about 5 times the speed at which I drew it. It is a fairly complex scene. So there was a little bit more thinking of what I was doing. In life, this took in real time. This took about 80 minutes to draw. But once I start doing the marker, that starts to take a fair bit of time. Simply putting one marker down, finding the one I want, taking the lid off, getting it onto the paper, and then doing that every time I swap my marker. So now just working out this sort of roughly triangular kind of sail shape coming towards us is probably the most complex shape, and it's the one that it really is worth taking time on, because we don't really have as much to guide its placement, and if we're not careful, it will come too far down the page, which will affect the alignment of the street and therefore the alignment of the buildings to the left. This is therefore the tricky part. The right-hand side was more straightforward. This is going to be harder to manage because we really have to work hard at keeping our lines relatively in the same position to each other. So again, I draw the gap between the two buildings because that's the easiest thing to draw. And then I get a vertical line that I can then start to position things with. Once I've got that vertical line, I start with the center pair of windows and I line those up with that center building that I've already drawn, with that original building I've drawn. And then I can do the windows up and down from that. And then I can get the corner of that building, and then I can align the corner of that building with the end of that wall where the ground drops. And so then I can position how far along exactly the ground comes. The wall comes before the ground turns around. So that's all very helpful. That's all I find just the best way to do it, drawing freehand when we can't erase any lines. So now I'm finishing the building here on the left-hand side. And now there's a figure I've discovered lurking in the shadows down below. But again, don't be tempted to not put these figures in, even if figures are a little bit intimidating to you, because they really are great at giving a sense of scale. So just trying to work out, there's another lamp coming off one of the walls. These are the sorts of details that it is nice to make sure we do, whatever other details we don't. You'll notice I put the sign on the front of the building on the right hand side. It can be tempting just to not bother with those, but unless they're somehow obtrusive to something that you're trying to create an effect you're trying to capture, I really think they do add a great sense of reality of everyday life. And that's what I think we want to capture, a sense of everyday life, a sense of reality of this village that has a bit of a rustic feel, where everything isn't smooth and aligned at right angles to each other. So having done that, I now switch back to my 0.1mm pen, and I work at doing this distant landscape. And again, the important thing is to capture the sense of undulating hills and of trees. And so I do some light hatching, aware that I'm going to put some values, some tone, some marker over the top. But I feel like it'll be more interesting with a bit of light line work underneath it. So now I'm getting pretty close to being finished with my pen, with my line. And so I'm just trying to work out how much detail I will do on the roadway. How much do I want to try and give the line work for the cobblestones? This is a bit of a decision, because it's not a straightforward thing to do. They are a fairly important part visually of the photo, but whether we can effectively create the scene giving some indication of the cobblestones and have it look right is another thing. So I've switched to my markers. I start with with an N0, the lightest value for the front. I go N3 for the right-hand side. And so now I'm really just moving through my range of values, the N0, N1, N2, N3, N4, and N5, which is the darkest value I use. Really getting a sense of how do they look, how do they work against each other. Is an area dark enough? Do I need it to be darker? One thing with a scene such as this that we want to try and avoid is too many surfaces that, if you like, look clean and smooth. Now, this right-hand side of this central building, I think, is a good example. It has a fairly earthy appearance in life, and we want to capture that, because that's part of what creates the sense of this being a village. Now it suddenly occurred to me that there's a lot of marker going to be going right up against the edge, so perhaps I'll just keep it a bit tidier and not be having to worry about alignment with edges and borders and things by popping the green tape on. So I've just used the N5 now for some of the darkest areas. I couldn't work out what wasn't quite right about the front of my centre building. It was just looking a bit bare, a bit clean, and after I'd finished everything and taken the photos of the finished drawing, I realised that there are some plaques on the building on each side of the door and just on the wall to the right of the door as well, the wall going back, that just break up the smoothness of those surfaces. And so once I just added those with my pencil, it just gave it that little bit more clutter, which made it align better with the reference. Now, I did that mountain range with an N2, picking it up thinking it was an N0. So there's not much I could do about that except stop using it and use the one I wanted to use. So now I'm just doing this doorway. Now, on the walls where we have the sunlight striking directly, I want to keep them white, regardless of what the actual colour is, because I want to get a strong sense of sunlight. Although, for where the sun is, the relative position it has to the buildings, most of what we see is in some sort of shade, and therefore creating some strong contrast where we do have the light is important. So in the doorways, in the windows of that building on the right, but also more particularly on the roadways. Now you'll notice that with the shadow that goes from the centre building across the road to the right, I've actually used two different values for that. I've used an N4 for the closer part, and I used N3 for the further part. And I wanted it to be dark, but I still wanted it to be a little bit darker in the closer part, not so much because it was closer, although that was a consideration, but because that section was between two buildings that were closer to each other, and therefore there's less light bouncing around, just creating a lightening effect on the shadow on the ground. So they're the sorts of subtleties it can be good to try and introduce into our buildings. And having done that, it's pretty much done. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, I hope you enjoyed this visit to this wonderful part of an Italian village on the side of a hill somewhere, trying to capture the light and the shadows and the shapes that we have in this great photo. So why not give it a go? I'll put the photo on my channel community page so you can get a copy from there and have a go trying to combine your line work and your value to capture whatever overall feel, essence of the scene most stirs you. But look, whatever you draw, however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.